Hello, the Sun-Gazette is happy to be joined today by David McCormick, former Undersecretary of the Department of the Treasury, combat veteran, and Republican nominee in this year's Senate race. Mr. McCormick, why do you believe inflation has been such a persistent problem the last several years?
You know, I think it's really almost indisputable what the cause of inflation is. So we have cumulative prices that have gone up by more than 20%. And wages haven't kept up. And so it's been a huge impact on Pennsylvanians. 60% of Pennsylvanians live paycheck to paycheck. So food, fuel, and rent, they're getting squeezed. And the direct cause of this is government spending. And, every mainstream economist would say that, Democratic economists would say that. And what's happened is Republicans and Democrats alike have been spending too much for the last 20 years. But under President Biden, there's a $5 trillion spike in new spending, and that's been the cause of inflation. The American Rescue Plan, which was $2 trillion, the Inflation Reduction Act, which in fact was part of the cause of inflation, that's been the driver of these price increases. The second cause of it has been, really a war on fossil fuels. So under the Biden administration and Senator Casey, my opponent, supported this 98% of the time in terms of the votes. What's happened is fossil fuels have become much more restrictive. So you had the LNG pause, you had the cancellation of the Keystone Pipeline. Very recently, you had the EPA under President Biden put in place, which Senator Casey supported, put in place a policy that by 2032, 70% of all new light vehicles, if you look out the street, 5% of the vehicles today are EVs. In less than 8 years, the Biden administration has mandated, again, Senator Casey supported it, that 70% will be electric vehicles. So all those things have driven up prices, and it's really biting Americans, and it's really biting Pennsylvanians. And so, the thing we have to do to get prices back on track and reduce that is pull back the spending. Much of that Biden-Casey spending, Biden-Harris-Casey spending can be stopped, and we gotta develop and open up our energy sector, because fuel prices alone are up 40 to 50%. You all know that. So when you show up at the pump, you can thank President Biden and Senator Casey, who's with him 90% of the time.
What role can the federal tax code play in providing Americans with relief from inflation and price increases?
Well, I wouldn't try to solve inflation through tax policy. I think we need to lower taxes. I think we need to extend the Trump tax cuts. Those have been very important for working families. A family of four that makes $52,000 a year got a $2,500 tax break under those under that tax plan that went in place under President Trump. Senator Casey, Kamala Harris have publicly said they want to not extend those tax cuts. So a family of four here in Williamsport will have a tax increase of $2,500. That just makes the problems with inflation harder, because you get more pressure. So the best way to deal with inflation is what I just said, is to open up our energy sector and reduce the cost, or reduce the spending. The other thing I think we should do, and it's related to your question, but I think it's important, is that because inflation's gone up so much, because it's more and more expensive, people are having less kids. So if you look at the birth rate across Pennsylvania, across the country, is less than replacement rate. So we have to have 2.1 kids on average per family to continue to have our population stay the same size or grow. And it's gone down to about 1.8. And part of the reason for that is it's just too expensive to have kids. I got 6 kids, so I feel this. 6 daughters, so I know what it's like. And so one of the things that I've proposed very explicitly is to increase the child tax credit, which will make it much easier to have kids, and to do a number of family policies that'll make it easier for people to save in ways that support childcare, tax-free savings. So these policies are meant to be pro-family, and they're going to be good for all families, but they're particularly going to be good for families that are living paycheck to paycheck and struggling to have kids and to make ends meet.
You've mentioned some of the steps that can be taken. What other measures can Congress pursue to prevent these sorts of inflationary spirals in the future?
Well, I'm a believer that government needs to play a role in protecting our citizens, protecting our national security. The number one mission of government is national security. But to be honest with you, I think government has been more a problem than a solution in terms of our economy and our economic well-being. And so I travel across our Commonwealth. I think this year alone, I've made something like 400 separate visits and events. Many of those are with small manufacturers. Many of those are with job creators. 80% of the jobs in Pennsylvania are created by small businesses. So the government needs to play a role that doesn't drive up inflation through all the spending. That's one thing it needs to do. But when I go to talk to people, they say the three biggest problems they have that are standing in the way of them creating more jobs, good paying jobs, is inflation, which we talked about. It's regulation, too much government. The cost of doing business is getting more and more expensive because of government intervention. And nowhere is that more clear than in the energy sector, and in particular fracking. So this region, of course, is, and I grew up not far from here, I grew up in Williamsburg. This region is blessed with incredible natural gas resources. That natural gas is the long pole in the tent for Pennsylvania's future. We have literally Saudi Arabia under our feet in terms of our natural gas capacity. We just can't get it out of the ground. We can't get pipelines to ship it to other states because of restrictive regulations. I just had an energy roundtable this morning where we talked about this. So the government needs to protect its citizens, but more than that, it needs to get out of the way of government, out of the way rather of industry, particularly the energy industry, driving opportunity here in Pennsylvania. That's the best way to deal with the economic challenges we're having in Pennsylvania. Reduce inflation by pulling back on spending. Open up our energy sector, which will create these fabulous, great-paying jobs, and let Pennsylvania take advantage of its incredible natural resources.
To preserve the sustainability of Social Security, what change should Congress adopt first, and what proposed change should Congress reject or rule out?
Well, I think the thing Congress has to rule out is not living up to the promises we made our elders. They paid into Social Security with a certain set of expectations. People on Social Security are the ones that are getting hurt most by the inflation because they're on fixed income. So when you talk about getting squeezed, people on fixed income, prices are going up. They're getting hammered. So I tell a joke on the campaign trail. My dad's 86. He lives in Enola, and my mom and dad live in Enola outside of Harrisburg. My dad called and said, "Listen, I love you, son, but I think you'd be a great senator, but you touch Social Security, I'm not voting for you." So we can't touch Social Security for our elders. And part of the reason it's not sustainable financially is that the Social Security account, which people paid into, has been raided by Washington senators like Bob Casey. If you look at the deficit under Casey, when he entered the Senate 18 years ago, it was $9 trillion. It's now over $30 trillion today, $35 trillion on the way up. We have an interest payment that's $1 trillion. So it's the out of control spending across the board that's the driving problem. It's not the spending from Social Security. So I wouldn't touch Social Security, but what I would do is put in place a set of fiscal constraints so people in Washington have to live just like we all do, which is within your means. And the best way to do that, I think, would be a balanced budget amendment, which would require the Congress to live within its means. It's going to take a while to get there, but that's the place we're in today, and it's irresponsible. And just to put in perspective, which this is a way that I think most Americans can make sense of this. Our interest payment today on our debt is $1 trillion. Our defense budget, the single most important responsibility of government is to protect us from foreign adversaries, is $900 billion. So we spend more on paying the interest on our debt than we do on paying for our defense. And listen, Bob Casey's been part of the problem, not part of the solution. He's been there for 18 years. Spending's been out of control. It's been more out of control under the last 3.5 years. And it's also the result, I'm sorry to go on this, but it's also the result not just of these incredible spending bills, but of a set of choices that I actually believe are completely out of step with Pennsylvania. So let me give you the best example of that. I don't think most Pennsylvanians, certainly the ones I meet on the campaign trail, believe this is a good idea. Senator Casey voted for and supported the student loan forgiveness plan that President Biden put into place. So what this is there's $160 billion of loan forgiveness that he's given students across our country. Now, listen, I want to make sure education is affordable, but I went to high school with just right down the road in Williamsburg with a couple friends. One of them didn't go to college. Part of the reasoning was how expensive it was. Maybe he didn't want to go either, but he chose not to. Another extended his time in college. These are guys my age, 58, 59 years old. Extended his college because he wanted to work during the time so he didn't take on too much debt. Those two guys, you two, everybody in Williamsport, is paying, regardless of what their choices were, they're paying for $160 billion. That's more than our Army's budget for student loan forgiveness. Some of whom for our kids that made a choice and maybe making, more than $100,000 a year. That is unfair. It's un-American. But those are the kinds of choices that I believe, I don't believe, it's true that Biden, Harris, and Casey have made. And those are choices that are out of step, and they make the pressures on Social Security, the pressures on our budget, dramatic. Final point. Our kids are never going to forgive us for this. Our kids are never going to forgive us because it's not going to affect you and I and the three of us so much because, we're a little further along. But right now, every American, if you take the debt of our entire country and divide it across our population, $160,000 of debt. Each one of our kids has $160,000 of debt on their head. So you think about the new debt that they're going to take on for college. They already got $160,000 of debt because of what Bob Casey and other people in Washington have done.
What role should the federal government have in improving access to affordable childcare?
Well, I mentioned it already. I think helping families afford the cost of first of all having children, and then being able to afford a home and a family life that allows them to prosper is kind of the most important thing we can do in our society. Families are struggling, so I gave a pro-family speech, which Nate can share with you, and this was profiled in a number of newspapers. But I had a couple policies which I thought were really important to doing just what. One is the child tax credit, which I talked about. So doubling the child tax credits, $1,000, make it $2,000 per child. That was in the Trump tax cut. So I doubled on that. I had a child care savings account, which you could save up to $10,000 tax-free to be able to support. And then I proposed a policy which got a lot of attention. I really think this is in many ways the most important thing we could do. Is I learned as a CEO, I was a CEO of two companies, and in my last company, I put in place a policy where the company paid for IVF, fertility treatment. I knew this was a big issue. Often case from many times when women are in the workforce and they wait till a little bit later to have kids, they struggle to have children, then they need fertility treatments, IVF. That's the primary one, IVF, to help them do that. It's incredibly expensive. It's something like $15,000 to $30,000 per treatment, depending on where you live. And those treatments aren't always effective. So some people may have to use it 2 or 3 times. So essentially what happens is people that are living, kind of on the edge, paycheck to paycheck, or just don't have a lot of discretionary income, they can't afford to have IVF. Therefore, they can't afford to have kids. So what happens is that the people that can afford to have kids it's just like school choice. The people that can afford to have kids are the ones that are wealthy enough to do it. That seems completely wrong to me. I think everybody that is, wants to have children, that is going to commit themselves to be good parents, should have the opportunity to have the joy of parenthood. I think it's critical to the future of our country. So I proposed an IVF tax credit rather. So similar to what I was describing for the child tax credit, you could take $15,000 of tax off of your tax bill and allocate it to IVF. And you could do that 2 times. So what that would do, it would allow the possibility of having children with IVF be available to kids, to parents across our country. And when I was a CEO, I gave that to women or men. If you were a man whose family was struggling. And that's the place where I would get the thank you notes, like, you changed my life. I think this is something that the government should think of. You will rarely hear me, as you've already heard, you'll rarely hear me saying, we need the government to get involved. That's usually not my answer to things. But in family policy, to be able to afford to have children through fertility treatment, but also to be able to afford to, have a family, I think that's an area where we should use the tax code through tax credits to really support families.
Should Congress increase the federal minimum wage? Why or why not?
Well, listen, Pennsylvania's minimum wage, I think, is $7.25. So we are completely, out of line with the states surrounding us, and people don't pay that wage, generally speaking, because they have to pay a competitive wage to compete with New York and Maryland and so forth. I'm generally not a fan of mandates from the government. This might be an area where I would consider a national minimum wage, which creates a working wage that people can actually be able to have a functional life. And you got to be careful, because if whenever government gets involved and they start to make choices like that, it can be very detrimental to business. So it's something I'd want to study, but something I'd be open to, because certainly the minimum wage in some places is not a wage that is sustainable for families. And unfortunately, wages have been getting pushed down by illegal immigration. So I want to make sure people understand that. Under the Biden-Harris-Casey administration, what's happened is we've had 10 million new illegal immigrants that are in our country. Many of those work in the labor force, not as necessarily registered or legal workers, but they work, and that drives down wages. So what's happening is essentially American citizens that are trying to make a living are competing with illegal immigrants who are working at lower wages and are in the dark economy where people don't know about it. We can't have that. So part of the way to not depress wages is to have a secure border where we don't have 10 million illegal migrants coming in over a 3.5-year period. And so that's an important part of getting wages right. But I would consider it, but I'd want to make sure I understood the second and third order consequences.
What one change could the federal government make to healthcare to improve access and affordability?
Well, my view on this is, we have the Affordable Care Act, which was passed under President Obama. It's failed in its two primary goals. Its primary goals, is said by President Obama at the time, that Senator Casey voted for, was it was going to reduce cost and enhance access, and it said you weren't going to have to change your doctor. And it certainly failed on the first one and the third one. So it failed cost of skyrocketed. Cost of healthcare have gone up more than the cost of many of the other things in our society. And people weren't able to keep their healthcare provider as they had hoped. But that is the law we have. And so I would be one of those people in the Senate that would be saying, okay, how do we make that law better? How do we make that legislation better? It failed at its goals. I wouldn't overturn that, but I would say, how do we make it better? And the primary way to make it better is through competition. We need to create competition where the healthcare industry is like other industries that are able to provide healthcare access to people. And in that competition, you're going to drive down price and increase quality. And the Affordable Care Act didn't do enough of that. So that's the primary thing. The second thing that's happened is that particularly for our elders, the price of healthcare has gone up, and particularly prescription drugs. And what's happened under Part D of Medicare is a 59% increase in prescription drugs under the Biden-Harris-Casey administration. And in particular, that was one area where they said prices would come down based on the Inflation Reduction Act. And in fact, prices have gone up. And so we gotta particularly focus on affordable health care for our elders. And as you know, kind of 80% of the healthcare cost for a citizen comes in the latter years of your life. So that's an area where we need to make a big difference.
You mentioned immigration a few moments ago. What are specific changes the U.S. should make to how refugees or immigrants seeking asylum are vetted?
Well, I think it's fair to say Senator Casey has been running an ad, which your readers may have seen, which I think is completely disingenuous. I think it's a complete misrepresentation of what's really happened here. What's really happened here is that under President Biden, with Senator Casey's support every step of the way, we took a dramatically different approach to immigration, and Senator Casey voted for stopping the wall. He voted against additional funding for the Border Patrol. He voted against a fentanyl initiative, which would have helped address this horrible scourge of people coming across the border with fentanyl. And it led to a complete overwhelming of the system, where I've been to the border 2 times in the last couple of years. I've been to the border more times than the borders are or Senator Casey. And it's absolutely overwhelming. And the notion of asylum was created in a way that under very selective circumstances, someone could apply for asylum and be granted. Entering the United States is a matter of, protecting our principles that we want to help people around the world that are under enormous duress. It was never meant to be a blanket green light into our country, but because the system's been so overwhelmed under the policies of Biden, Harris, and Casey, we've had this enormous onslaught. I literally went there in the middle of the night with the Border Patrol. I saw 50 people walk right across the border in front of me in Yuma, Arizona. I posted this on social media so you can see it for yourself. In that group, I saw there were 5 military-age men from Syria, 5 Chinese nationals. And what happens is they apply for asylum. There's no way to document it, get them the hearing. So they're released into society, and they get a hearing 12, 24, 36 months later. There's no way of tracking them. It's complete chaos. And it's the direct result of a fundamental reversal of the policies that were put in place by Trump and worked. If you look at the charts on legal immigration entry, it's a fraction of what it is now. This is the difference between strength and weakness, bad policy versus good policy. So that's where we are. We need to have an asylum policy which essentially goes back to remain in Mexico and keeps asylum seekers on the other side of the border. We need to have a path that shows that asylum hearings and asylum is going to be under the rarest of circumstances. It's not a method to get access to the United States illegally. People are coming across our border as illegal immigrants with the expectation, it's because the expectation Biden and Harris and Casey have set, that they will have a path to legal citizenship. There should not be a path to legal citizenship coming across our border illegally. Otherwise, you're going to have an incentive system where everybody wants to come in illegally as opposed to go through the right paths. So this is a dramatic failure that's had huge economic cost, huge national security cost, huge human cost with the fentanyl crisis to the citizens of Pennsylvania, and we need to 100% reverse it. And the law that Senator Casey touts is the law that he voted for, which, by the way, he voted for this in an election year after the Democrats didn't do anything on the border. They said the problem was that President Biden had his hands tied, which of course he didn't. The bill that Senator Casey voted for and says was this great thing was not a border security law. It was a law to expedite the asylum. And it set a limit of 5,000 per day that it would allow up to before the government would have further ability for restrictions. Based on that proposed legislation, I went and looked, or had my team look, at every industrialized country in the world. There is no country in the world, not in Europe, not in Asia, not China, not Japan, that have anything close to an asylum system that allows up to 5,000 people a day. It's completely, go and talk to the people on the street in Williamsport and say, do we want 5,000 people a day coming in under an asylum policy? So it would have been a very permissive policy that would have continued to pose real risks to the United States. This is one where I think Biden, Harris, and Casey are just completely out of touch with Pennsylvania and America, and it was deeply flawed.
Can you cite a policy or initiative President Biden pursued that you thought was worthwhile?
Well, I think the following. I think that if you look at what he has said in a particular area, which I'll come to in a minute, I'm aligned with some of the things he said. I just think the execution of that's been deeply flawed. So the area which is a very polarizing issue, something that people across Pennsylvania and America are focused on, is what's happening in Ukraine. So I believe we are in the mess we're in Ukraine, and Russia attacked Ukraine because of the weakness that President Biden showed in responding to Afghanistan and the debacle we had there. That's one of the reasons I got into the race in 2022. The primary is that as a military guy, as a West Point grad, as a combat vet, I thought that was a disgrace. But that sent a signal to the world. It sent a signal to the bad guys. Then President Biden went on to approve the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which was a signal to Putin, hey, we're going to play ball. And Putin subsequently, soon after that, and by the way, Senator Casey voted for that allowing the Keystone pipeline. Soon thereafter, Putin invaded Ukraine. He knew he was dealing with weakness, and that created a huge issue, which is how do we support or not support Ukraine in defending itself against Russia. I believe we should support Ukraine defending itself against Russia with military aid. I think we should give Ukraine military aid to fight back against Russia. I don't believe we should give them economic aid, which President Biden wants to do, because I think the government's very corrupt, and we wouldn't be sure taxpayer money would go there. And I absolutely agree with President Trump and Senator Vance that we got to make the Germans and the French pay for their fair share. But I believe we should support Ukraine with military aid because we said we would when they gave up their nuclear weapons in the early 90s. Because if Putin's successful in Ukraine, I think he'll continue to challenge other parts of Europe, which will be bad for America, bad for our interests. We're not doing this as a favor. This is bad for America. And third, I think our biggest adversary is China. And I think China's watching. And I think we need to give strong military support to Ukraine, even if at the same time I think we need to absolutely force and push for a resolution of this with Russia sooner rather than later. So that's one area where I think President Biden's instincts to give military aid were right. I think we wouldn't be there without him, and the execution's been deeply flawed, and he hasn't held Europe accountable. But I'm in favor of military aid to Ukraine.
Thank you for joining us today and for answering our questions.
My pleasure. Good to be with you. Thank you.